I hope everybody can hear me. I'm going to start with some administrative stuff, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker, Gary Kendall, and then I'm going to shut up, and then I'll pick it up when Gary's finished. But to begin with, I want to ask you all to do two things. First of all, please go to your speaker view and mute your microphones. And then please use the chat function to speak to one another, to comment, to introduce yourself, to ask any questions you might have. We won't be interrupting the presentation while it's going on, so you might have ideas, you might have rejoinders, you might have rants, whatever. Please put them in the chat, and so we'll have a record of them and we'll be able to come back to you. And when you have questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat. We're going to have Tamsin and Jordi are going to be collating these and making sure that I see them so that we can get to them once Gary's finished. The other thing that we want you to do is maybe if you have new ideas or you're reacting in a particularly vehement way, put an asterisk on your comment. We've booked the space until 7:30 Central European time, and that means that we have plenty of time to at least begin this conversation, although frankly we're really hoping that all of you will feel this may be worth continuing and that it's not being problematic. My friend John has just asked the question, is the session being recorded? Indeed it is. So we're asking your permission to do that, and the reason we're recording it is we're going to send you at the end of all of this a summary of what was said, of what the questions are, of what the kind of direction you guys want to go in might be. And we will also send you Gary's presentation. So that's something we think we owe you, and we will do that afterwards. The Trust is also offering its site for a place for the conversation to go on further. And so we have a platform. But frankly, it's not like we've pre-designed it. We really need to figure out where we're going, and then we have some resources and some capacity to be able to deliver. That's it from the rules of the game. Let's try and be polite to one another. I'm Jerry Salol. I'm really just the traffic cop here. I don't know why they asked me to do it. I'm not a very good traffic cop. I'm very opinionated. So I'll try and keep my opinions in check and ask you all to just make sure that you actually engage with this. Everybody that's been invited to this has been invited very, very carefully and was selected because we know you have opinions and you have views, and we wanted to get beyond the kind of superficial take on things. And that brings me to Gary. Gary has impressed me. I haven't known him very long, but he's what I've been looking for a long time, somebody who takes some distance from things and connects dots. And frankly, if we don't connect the dots, we have problems. And I think what we're going to be treated to is a very interesting exposition of connecting the dots. And then we'll see where we go from there. Having said that, I'm going to not interrupt Gary. I'm not going to ask him questions while he's talking. This, I know, has been billed as a conversation and a dialogue. We're going to get there, and I hope we're going to get there over time. But I think just to start us off, that's why we called it the prologue. We wanted somebody who can connect the dots to just talk to us. And now, as I promised you, I will shut up. Gary, the show is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Jerry. Can someone, maybe Jerry, just indicate whether I'm being heard loud and clear? Okay, that's good. So good evening, afternoon, morning. I'm not sure what time zone people are joining us from, but anyway, maybe hello is easier. And it's nice to talk to everybody. And so perhaps just a quick word of context here. I've been engaging with business audiences around climate change for about the last 15 years or so, and finding sort of better or worse ways of doing that. And what happened when the pandemic kicked off, and particularly, I have family in Italy. I have a niece and a nephew in northern Italy. So I found myself becoming quite engrossed by the pandemic, probably before most people in South Africa had realized what was going on. And I heard the pandemic was described as like climate change on warp speed. I can't remember where I heard that. And then I started to notice some parallels between the pandemic and climate change, but also, quite importantly, some contrasts. And that's really the purpose of this session, is to explore some of the parallels and the contrasts between the pandemic and climate change. I believe that the pandemic provides us with a unique opportunity to learn about the character of systemic risk. And we're learning lessons through this pandemic that we will need to draw upon over the next few years if we're going to successfully confront climate change. So that's my kind of introductory piece. Now, there's a lady who's expert in leadership coaching and development. Many of you may know, Jennifer Garvey-Berger. She issues 3 challenges to leaders of change. She challenges us to ask different questions, to take multiple perspectives, and to think in systems. And so it's in that spirit that I'm going to offer you this contribution to hopefully kick off a discussion. So we tend to be captivated by events, and we experience and react to events typically in isolation from the larger system from which they emerge. I'm going to give you, I'm going to read a quote actually that I picked up from Goldman Sachs, which was only 3 months ago. This was middle of March. Goldman Sachs, I don't know, analyst said on a call for investors, there's no systemic risk here. No one's even talking about that. Governments are intervening in the markets to stabilize them. The private banking sector is very well capitalized. This feels more like 9/11 than it does 2008. So that was 3 months ago. And even if that were true, this kind of proves the point to a certain extent, because I think most people would agree that we reacted to the event of 9/11 without really understanding the kind of system in which it emerged. And so I'm going to quote now from Donella Meadows, who was one of the one of the authors from The Limits to Growth in 1972, I think. And so she said, it's endlessly engrossing to take in the world as a series of events, and it's constantly surprising because that way of seeing the world has no predictive or explanatory value. Like the tip of an iceberg rising above the water, events are the most visible aspects of a larger complex, but are not usually the most important. So here's a way of thinking about what Donella was talking about, this iceberg model, where we have events poking up above the surface, patterns and trends around, about, or just beneath the surface. But beneath that, much more importantly, systems and structures, and right at the bottom, mental models or paradigms or worldviews, if you like. And these two, the events and the patterns, are the most visible, by far the most visible. The systems and structures and the mental models are very rarely seen. And what we do at the different levels is we react to events. We occasionally anticipate the patterns and the trends. We very rarely set about designing or redesigning systems and structures. And we even less frequently consider what it means to actually transform our paradigms or our mental models. I'll just give you an example of, what do I mean when I say mental model or paradigm? So the Earth is flat. There's a good example of a mental model that at some point in our history needed updating, at least for most of us. Another example is of a mental model that's the social responsibility of businesses to increase its profits, which many of you will recognize as the title of Milton Friedman's famous New York Times article in 1970. Now, if we want to bring about change, the deeper we go in this iceberg model, the more leverage we have, but also the harder it becomes, the harder it is. Now, you might ask, well, why do we have to change paradigms anyway? Well, the reason is because the complexity of our problems is now growing beyond our capacity to respond. And when the task demands of civilization exceed the capacities of that civilization to respond, then you've got an existential problem. So that's my preamble to the main part of the presentation, in which I'm going to touch on 4 different areas. The first is, what did the pandemic, or what has the pandemic revealed to us or clarified for us about our socioeconomic system? Then I'm going to talk about parallels between the pandemic and climate change, and then contrasts. And then I'm going to finish with some words about what this might mean for the future. So, first up, what has this pandemic clarified or revealed to us about our socioeconomic system? So I start with another quote. I think each section I begin with a quote. So some of you recognize this from Tim Jackson. We spend money we don't have on things we don't need to create impressions that won't last on people we don't care about. Now, as I go around and discuss, what we're all experiencing together around the pandemic, I think that for me, this quote really encapsulates a lot of what people are experiencing, because we're understanding and we're clarifying for ourselves what's really important and what occupies us or previously occupied us that actually is rather frivolous. So first thing is to notice that, when everything's fine, it's very easy to bemoan taxes and to want to dismantle the state and privatize things, and the government needs to shrink and get out of the way. But when all hell breaks loose, then we realize that a well-resourced and functional government and public services are critical. And we realize that we've underinvested in them. And that's the key word. Public services are investments, not liabilities. They perform essential functions where the private profit motives are misaligned with delivering to the public interest. We've also clarified for ourselves that multilateralism and cooperation and communication is vital for solving global problems. And at the same time, fear and insecurity can drive us apart and into parochialism. And we've seen, for instance, the US withdrawing its funding and support for the World Health Organization. And this is, I consider to be quite a worrying sign. The distinction between what truly matters, or if you like, essential needs, and what doesn't, non-essential wants, has really been clarified. And seemingly quite a substantial percentage of our economic activity has been revealed to be non-essential. Now, this isn't to say that it's worthless or that it's without any value. It's just to say that it's non-essential. And this has become clear to us because the distinction between essential workers, particularly in countries that have been undergoing severe lockdown like South Africa, and the classification of an essential worker has kind of revealed to us what's really essential. And it's also revealed that providers of essential services are frequently very poorly remunerated. And there's a real mismatch between value creation and distribution of rewards within the economy. And that's quite a stark mismatch. So the market doesn't pay people in a way that matches their social importance. Essential workers really are essential, and without them, the economy collapses, and they're typically on the lowest wages. So just to kind of unpack what I mean about the difference between essential needs and non-essential wants. Needs are universal, objective, non-substitutable, satiable, and cross-generational. And often when business talks about meeting client needs, they're actually talking about meeting client wants, which are individual, subjective, substitutable, insatiable, and evolving. And I think that distinction is really important to think about as we move forwards. There's a difference between efficiency and resilience. And in fact, in many ways, efficiency is antithetical to resilience. So the tendency to outsourcing, offshoring, just-in-time production and delivery systems, whose purpose is to cut costs by minimizing stocks and so on, is actually creating fragility to shocks. Contingency planning requires unused capacity, and yet that kind of shows up in the business world as an opportunity to drive more efficiency. But idle resources are actually what you need in a crisis. So some degree of inefficiency is a good idea when it comes to a crisis. And nature knows that resilience comes from redundancy. And the market actually does quite a lousy job of buffering people against totally undeserved catastrophic economic dislocations. So inequality and poverty means that we're not all in this together. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, it was very popular to say, well, you know, we're all in this together because, you know, we're all threatened by the pandemic equally. And it's not true. COVID-19 is not an equal opportunities killer. Around the world, health outcomes are much worse in poorer communities. People are more likely to have to continue working at one end of the inequality spectrum, which not only raises their risk of infection, they may have to work while infected, which raises the onward risk of, if you like, forward infections. And, you know, in the US, I think you're 3 times more likely to die from COVID-19 if you're Black. So this is not an all in it together situation. What we've also seen is fringe ideas moving into the mainstream. Sorry, I think I may have just lost track of my slides here. Yeah, I beg your pardon. So fringe ideas or radical ideas that are now receiving serious attention from our leaders because hitherto unknown political resources have been discovered. And resources can be found seemingly from nowhere. So we see financial resources kind of conjured from nowhere, government stimulus packages and so on. And now flirtations with radical ideas like a universal basic income. So another thing is that that time seems to be doing something quite unusual during the pandemic. So we see that as time seemingly slows down, the future can actually accelerate. So while we're all kind of in some degree of stasis, in a kind of holding pattern, we see accelerating technology trends like telecommuting and online commerce and migration to digital channels and autonomous vehicles and all sorts of things. They're not new trends, but they're now gaining additional momentum. So the image here, in case anyone's interested, is from a British science fiction series called Black Mirror. And now we see kind of a robot dog wandering around in an Asian shopping mall dispensing disinfectant to shoppers. Now we're experiencing a discontinuity here that has the scale of the Great Depression, the speed of the 1987 crash, and the fear of 9/11. So this is a massive economic discontinuity, and yet it's delivered an estimated greenhouse gas emissions reduction of 8% annualized. So this just exposes really that our economy remains absolutely firmly, inextricably shackled to greenhouse gas emissions, and even a discontinuity like that is only going to deliver for us a very modest reduction in greenhouse gases. So that's a few words on what this pandemic has revealed about our socioeconomic system. I'm going to now talk about some parallels between the pandemic and climate change. So firstly, quote from Bill McKibben: "It may provide an object lesson in what happens when you don't cooperate with other countries. A wall can't keep out the COVID microbe any more than it can knock down a CO2 molecule." So first thing is that the the nature of systemic risk is that it's not just a risk that exists in the system, it's a risk that exists to the system. And a systemic risk is like a threat multiplier, and it creates dozens of crises all tangled into one. And that's something that we're all experiencing at the moment. Now, you'll be familiar, I think, with the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. And that comes out every January, and it uses these categorizations of risk: economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal, and technological. Now, when we're talking about systemic risk, these labels are on one level completely arbitrary, because the impacts are transmitted and experienced through human systems. And those impacts are much more severe and widespread than the underlying natural phenomenon. What I mean by that is there's roughly 8 million people worldwide have tested positive for this virus, but roughly 8 billion people worldwide are being impacted by this episode of the pandemic. And it's the same with climate change. It's not so much the natural phenomenon, it's what does that do and how are the risks transmitted through the system. And people are much more likely, as I said at the beginning, to respond to events rather than trends, and are much less likely to re-examine the systems and the structures and the mindsets that underpin them. And to illustrate this point, I'm presenting to you now, some of you will recognize this from the WEF Global Risk Report. Every year, the World Economic Forum surveys global experts and asks them to consider what do they think are the top 10 risks, the top risks by likelihood and impact over the next 10 years. And what I'm showing here, I'm not sure if you'll be able to read the text on the screen, but this is the last 14 years summary, looking at the top 5 risks in terms of likelihood. That's at the top of the screen. And then the top 5 global risks in terms of impact. Now have a look at this. Pandemics last appeared in 2007 and 2008 and haven't come back in the last 12 years. Now, why is that? Why might that be? Well, that's because we had a avian flu, the H5N1 outbreak from 2003 to 2009, and then it passed. And then in 2008, we had the global financial crisis. And you'll notice in 2009, there are risks that relate to the global financial crisis. But hang on, there's infectious disease in 2015. So maybe that's what, that's the new category for pandemic. Well, actually, no, this infectious disease appeared on the risk register in 2015 because the last major Ebola outbreak was in 2014. Now, in the last 4 or 5 years, you see climate change risks appearing everywhere because extreme weather events and other climate concerns have been mounting since we passed the 1 degree Celsius of warming in 2015. So the point that I want to make here is that our selection is heavily biased by our experience of events in the here and now. These are global experts that are being asked to consider risks over the next 10 years. And this is quite substantially backward looking and consumed by events that are going on in the present. And I'm going to make a prediction now that in the 2021 edition of the Global Risk Report, we're going to see pandemics back after a 12-year absence. Now, we also see, again, another parallel, these competing and overlapping priorities. So there's the public health concern, the health of society, but then there's the health of the economy. And there's a tendency to set these kind of in competition with one another, that there's we create false dichotomies and we frame scenarios around a zero-sum mindset. And then there's the concerns around loss of civil liberty and track and trace apps and all that kind of stuff when we're giving away privacy. In actual fact, it's quite okay, and in fact necessary, to occupy this space in the middle where we can think about how do we balance these competing and overlapping priorities, that we needn't be dragged into one domain of concern versus the other and then compete over, as I say, a kind of zero-sum mindset. And it's exactly the same with climate change. You'll be familiar with Lord Stern's report on the economics of climate change, and the point that he makes that we create a false horse race between acting on climate change and acting to, you know, sustain economic growth. Is like you have both or neither, right? These things are not in competition. As Nick Stern calls it, it's a completely fake horse race. What we're also seeing in the pandemic and climate change is the battle between science, expertise, and conspiracy and fake news. So to survive this largely intact, we have to give primacy to scientific expertise versus conspiracy theories and fake news. But the problem is that fake news tends to travel faster and it tends to stick, or if you'll forgive the pun, it tends to go viral. Now, the science tends to be difficult, dry, and nuanced, and maybe feels disempowering for the layman, whereas fake news tends to be easy, entertaining, and sort of categorical, and it appeals to the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is, you know, the less I know, the more confident I am about my opinion. Everyone's seen a picture like this, I'm sure, around the pandemic. This was the kind of that entered the kind of public consciousness first early, which was we have to flatten the curve because that buys us time and allows for society to respond effectively. If we can slow down the rate of progression, we can avoid overwhelming institutional capacity. So this is the flattening the pandemic curve. Now have a look at the greenhouse gas emissions curve. Flattening the curve buys time. If we'd started reducing emissions in 2000, then we could have reduced emissions at a rate of around 1 to 2% a year, and we could have had a 2/3 chance of staying below 2 degrees. Now, delaying 10 years increases the gradient, which increases the rate of reduction, which reduces society's capacity to respond, and it overwhelms our institutional capacity. And now if we start in 2020, we're talking about emissions reductions of over more than 5% a year. So you see how a flatter curve is easier to deal with and how a steeper curve is much harder to deal with. And yet the area under the curve is the same in each case. And so that's quite a nice parallel with the idea of flattening the pandemic curve. There's also what I call the mitigation paradox. I'm going to unpack this in a couple of different ways. Firstly, and this is something that became very clear to me watching how this was unfolding in Italy. At every point in time, the correct course of action seems to be out of proportion with the facts on the ground. And this is linked to our inability to understand the power of exponential growth. So at the point that you need to lock down and maybe close schools and then subsequently lock down society, it seems that that's out of proportion with what's going on. Now, South Africa locked down before there was a single fatality in this country from the pandemic. And, you know, so that was quite a difficult thing for people to process. Because it's like, well, you know, why are we locking down here? There's no issue. And then, of course, by the time there's a big issue, it's too late to do anything about it. So that's part of the paradox. The other part is that success fosters cynicism. So well, that's because we were effective in our mitigation. And another thing to notice is that the effective and strong mitigation it's involuntarily imposed because the costs are borne by private institutions, whether that's businesses or citizens. The costs are borne by private entities, but the benefits accrue to the system. And so that has to be forced upon us by public policy. And that's exactly the situation that we're in with climate change, which is why we kick and scream around, we kick the can down the road to avoid mitigation. But when it comes to adaptation, the benefits accrue more to the individual. So it's a much easier proposition to process. Lastly, in this section, whether we're talking about the pandemic or climate change, we're all praying for a technological silver bullet. We're praying for a vaccine or hoping for a vaccine. We're hoping for the equivalent of a vaccine for climate change, whether that's a breakthrough in cold fusion or some geoengineering fix. We're driven by a desire to return to business as usual without any fundamental lasting change. So that's my piece on parallels. And now I'm going to talk about contrasts. So I think this is actually more interesting to see where this is different, because it's become fashionable to talk about the parallels, but I think the contrasts are quite revealing and quite alarming. So again, start with a quote, this time from Tom Burke. I'm sure many of you know Tom. The viral disruption was a sudden and visible shock that commanded and got an immediate response. Climate change is a stealth disruptor. Its impacts on our lives are remorselessly incremental and all the more dangerous for that. So this is what a wet market looks like in China. Here are some bats up for sale, and this is what a bat looks like in a bowl of soup. And this is currently the best understanding of where the pandemic emerged from. Now, it's easy here to point to a cause, and the cause is other, and the cause is identifiable, and almost there's an enemy outside of us, and that was the cause. Now, this has been even written about in clinical journals, and this is something that I dug out from a journal of clinical microbiology back in 2007. The presence of a large reservoir of SARS-CoV-like viruses in horseshoe bats, together with the culture of eating exotic mammals in southern China, as a time bomb. The possibility of the re-emergence of SARS and other novel viruses from animals and laboratories, and therefore the need for preparedness should not be ignored. So here's peer-reviewed science back in 2007. So this was no black swan. Now the problem with the contrast here with climate change is it's the enemy within. It's climate change is caused not by an exotic activity that we can identify with a particular ethnic group that makes us feel more comfortable about ourselves. But climate change is caused by virtually all everyday activities that people undertake innocently, going about the course of their daily lives. And linked to this are the vested interests. So the measures that we have to take to combat the pandemic, things like, you know, the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the social distancing, the personal hygiene, the disinfecting our hands, using hand sanitizer regularly and washing and so on, that isn't really threatening to any vested interests. But when we talk about climate change, this is driven by activities that are inextricably linked to sources of economic and political power. So we're talking about something that's threatening a large percentage of the Fortune 500. The existing paradigm is where the vested interests lie, and that's what's driving climate change. It's quite different with the pandemic. Now, there's a number of points that I want to make here around the kind of the sphere of concern and psychology of risk. So firstly, the pandemic captures universal attention. You can go out onto the street now, and the first person you bump into, you can talk about the pandemic and they're going to have an opinion on it because it's captivating us, because again, we're captivated by events. Climate change, on the other hand, captures specialist attention. So there may be, you might luck yourself into bumping into someone that has a view on climate change. It's maybe less informed if they have a view. They may not have a view, but the point is that our sphere of concern is different. Climate change is capturing specialist attention, whereas the pandemic captures universal attention. And it's partly to do with the psychology of risk. So the pandemic is threatening to me here now, and the climate change is a threat to someone else, somewhere else, sometime else, if I can put it like that. It's a hyper object that presents itself as a sequence of disparate events that are kind of remote from me here and now. And again, linked to that, the pandemic is kind of like it's a single event happening everywhere, more or less the same. Whereas climate change unfolds differently in different parts of the world at different times. So the virus is the virus, whether you're in San Francisco or in Cape Town or in Wuhan. But actually climate change may be wildfires in one part of the world. It could be droughts in another part of the world. It could be floods, or it could be loss of agricultural yields. And so it expresses itself very differently. So our experience of it is very different, and it doesn't happen all at the same time. So now the difference in the feedback, the difference in the speed is of the pandemic versus climate change is really important. Again, from Donella Meadows, a delay in a feedback process is critical relative to the rates of change in the system state that the feedback loop is trying to control. Over long delays in a system with a threshold danger point, a range past which irreversible damage can occur, causes overshoot and collapse. So what do I mean by that? Now, it may not feel like it, but the pandemic operates on a pretty fast feedback, comparatively fast. So this is the daily infection curve for Germany. Let's have a look what they did. They closed schools on the 13th of March, borders on the 15th. There was a national curfew on the 22nd. The peak of infections was the 27th. There was a gradual reopening of the economy on the 4th of May. And the Bundesliga opened on the 16th of May. That's 52 days between school closures and getting back to something approximating normal service, although you can see the Bundesliga is playing in front of empty stands, but something approximating normal service. 52 days. Now, here's what climate change looks like. Some of you are going to recognize this slide from the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. So what it shows is, in two extreme cases, this is the scenario in which, what this is, by the way, is a temperature curve against time, against the year. And this is showing what happens in the kind of unconstrained high emissions scenario. By the end of the century, we're looking at maybe 4.5 degrees temperature rise versus the pre-industrial level. And if in the strong mitigation case, we're at 1.5 degrees, that's an extremely low emissions scenario. This is quite unlikely at the moment. But now here's the rub. Over the next 30 years, there's almost no difference between those two scenarios. The overlap in the uncertainty range, which is the kind of the light shaded area, is very, very strong up to 2050. And it's only after 2050 that we start to realize that there's a huge, huge difference between these two scenarios. Now, this is really troubling for me. What this means is that over the next 30 years, the amount of warming that we're going to experience is remarkably insensitive to the emissions trajectory over the next 30 years. And that's due to the inertia in the system, the very, very slow feedback loop. Now, this is really worth thinking about seriously, because if we embarked on a crash carbon diet today in 2020, and we don't necessarily notice any benefit until 2050 or later, that's an incredibly challenging proposition. Now, how do you maintain political legitimacy for that when you're maybe taking some unpopular actions over the course of 3 decades? This is what Mark Carney, the previous governor of the Bank of England, calls the tragedy of the horizon, because the moment it becomes clear to everyone through their lived experience that we have to take very decisive action, it's just too late. So the pandemic offers us a kind of a glimpse of light at the end of the tunnel. It's possible to envisage what the end of these lockdowns look like, and it's possible to imagine for ourselves that there's a time after the pandemic. There was a time before Spanish flu and there was a time after Spanish flu, and they were more or less similar. But with climate change, there's no time after climate change, right? It's kind of a one-way ticket. Now, that's important because pain is accepted with the pandemic measures because we know it, we understand it's short term. And yet, even after just 2 or 3 months, we've got lockdown fatigue, and it's becoming really uncomfortable for people. And we're talking about the measures that we're going to have to take on climate change lasting not 2 to 3 months, but 2 to 3 decades. And the final point here is the kind of reversibility. So we can imagine a post-pandemic world that approximates the pre-pandemic world. But with climate change, the shifts are irreversible on a human time frame. So when we get to 2050, the climate system doesn't look like 2020. It's going to look worse because we've already baked in those 20 to 30 years of inertia that I mentioned. We're talking about permanent reconfiguration of our economies and irreversible changes in the climate system over a human time frame. So now just a few words on what the future may hold. So again, I start with a quote, this time from Ed Wilson, the famous Harvard entomologist. It says, modern humanity is distinguished by Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. Effectively, we're chimpanzees with nukes, and we have this unprecedented capacity to enact consequences, and we need to develop unprecedented wisdom to guide that power. So the first thing that I noticed here when thinking about the future, in fact, when thinking about the pandemic as a whole, is that I was sitting in a social media preference bubble or an echo chamber, and everyone was seeing the same as I was seeing. So actually what I did was I kind of deliberately tried to puncture that preference bubble, and I went to look for, what are other people saying? What does the, what's the kind of staunch libertarian view of this, right? Not just the view of a corporate sustainabologist. And it was quite fascinating to see, because the pandemic has actually been like a worldwide simultaneous Rorschach test. Do we see the beautiful butterfly emerging here from the chrysalis, or do we see the devil himself reaching out of our screens and trying to grab us by the throat? Well, it depends on our own confirmation bias. So take this next section with that in mind. So we've seen, as I think I mentioned in the earlier section, this newfound depths of political will, potentially. Government responses to the pandemic have been unprecedented in scale and speed, and this may embolden more courageous and more ambitious action around climate change. And we see this, I think, in the EU, where we see conditionality around the stimulus packages and so on that should explicitly favor low carbon sustainable development. But elsewhere, stimulus packages, it's very tempting to prop up supposedly too big to fail incumbents. So this is all to play for at the moment. Looking at the energy system, it's really interesting, of course, what happened with the collapse in the oil price. And then there was some back and forth and some debate and some fairly strident views about whether this was going to be beneficial to the renewable energy transformation or if it was going to hinder it. And I honestly, I don't know. But what I do believe is that the foundations of the fossil fuel energy system are trembling and the energy future is up for grabs. And whereas we were always led to believe that, the problem with renewable energy is the storage problem. And actually, it turns out that the oil industry has a storage problem. And when the onshore storage tanks were filling up, oil had to be stored at sea. And actually, the price very briefly went negative because there was literally nowhere to put oil. So who knew the oil industry had a storage problem? Now, air pollution, I think, was one of the first kind of noticeable changes in our environment. And air pollution is something that, coming back to the feedback loops, it visibly clears pretty quickly when normal economic activity is suspended. We notice that the sky clears. We see blue skies this is a picture from Delhi, I think, showed the air pollution clearing very rapidly, wildlife returning to urban areas. And yet, atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations continue to grow, even while even with the pandemic-related emissions cuts, greenhouse gas concentrations continue to grow, albeit at a slower rate. And so I think what I've noticed is a conflation between air pollution, which is a serious public health emergency, and climate change, as if the causes are the same, and the causes and the effects are the same, and they're really not. So in actual fact, the long-term beneficial climate impact of this one-off emissions cut, if it is to be one-off, probably won't be detectable in the long term. If this is a one-off emissions cut of between 5 and 8%, and then we have a rebound, we won't detect the beneficial impact of that in the long term. But the short-term impact may actually be an increase in warming this year because of the immediate loss of air pollution reduces the reflectivity in the atmosphere. The air pollution typically acts as a kind of a shield, a sunscreen, if you like. So we may even see a slight uptick in warming as a consequence of reduced air pollution in 2020. And as I said, atmospheric greenhouse gases themselves, the emissions have fallen, but as I said, not by much. So what we see in terms of an emissions cut this year represents about 1 year of the percentage cuts that we're going to need every year over the next decade. So if you remember the curve that I showed, and it's getting steeper and steeper, we need to cut emissions every year by between 5 and 8% over the next decade if we're going to have a chance of avoiding the dangerous climate change. And that's what we've got this year. And we have to repeat that trick every year for the next decade. Unfortunately, the cause of these emissions cuts is economic catastrophe. And this may discourage future action. So this just plays into the idea that cutting emissions is the same as economic cataclysm. And of course it's not, because if we plan emissions cuts, it's actually going to be economically advantageous for us. Voluntary action is usually less painful than involuntary action, and what we've been subjected to has been involuntary. Now, the pandemic response has been, I think, particularly painful because we're a social species, and in times of crisis, it's absolutely natural for us to come together and to connect with one another. And yet that's actually the last thing that we're able to do. And so many of the kind of analogies that have been drawn around this is kind of like a wartime situation. They don't really work for me, because usually in times of crisis, people come together. And I think we can do that in the response to this. I think we can rediscover the kind of social character of our species. And we have to do that. And the response to climate change can actively serve to reconnect us and heal divides. So the social distancing that we're experiencing is kind of an extreme expression of already widening gaps between rich and poor, destruction of middle classes, divide and conquer. And we can and must reverse that if we're going to thread the needle on climate change. So we find ourselves at a crossroads. This series is entitled Conversations at the Crossroads. This discontinuity triggered by the pandemic creates a rare peacetime opportunity to recalibrate our priorities, to reconsider our possibilities, and to reconfigure our politics and economies and business models. This is probably our final window of opportunity to install a new operating system that and actually address climate change. But the temptation to once again, as we did in 2008, reboot the old system, to hit Control-Alt-Delete and restart the same operating system may just be overwhelming, and it will be unforgivable. So now, I think I've spoken for long enough. This is actually wrapping up now. Some of you are going to recognize this quote from, maybe it's an unusual source in the context of this discussion. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. Now we've got loads of ideas lying around, and we've been trying to get takers for those ideas for many, many, many years. And maybe this crisis is an opportunity to revisit some of those ideas. So while everything seems to have changed during this crisis, the world's been kind of pushed off a cliff and everything's up for grabs, it's actually instructive to consider what hasn't changed. And what hasn't changed is what is really essential needs versus non-essential wants. So what do we really need versus what's frivolous? Now, to maintain cohesion and support for decisive action, I think we have to focus on the systemic co-benefits that have revealed themselves during this pandemic. What have we rediscovered through this crisis? What do we want to retain? And what of the pre-pandemic world would we rather discard? And with that, I'm going to stop. And I think I hand back to Jerry. And I just appreciate your time and patience in hearing me out. And now over to you, Jerry.